offense is needed and coal needs to be for something, and that something is technology. So let's take a look at the coal. And can I step away from this mic, or does that cause the recording problem? Great, thank you. Okay. What this chart shows you, can you hear me okay? This is coal-fired power generation by decade. So in 1950, we installed 11,412 megawatts. 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, all the way through. This little guy down here was a power plant in Alaska. One power plant built in the 20s. So clearly, this is the vast majority of power generation. In West Virginia, we have almost 8,300 megawatts built in the 70s. In the 60s, 2,200 megawatts. Mountaineer, 1,300 megawatts in the 1980s. Grant Town was a too small one, 130 megawatts, and I think there's one more Longview in 2010, the decade of 2010. So, what does this tell us? This tells us that in 50, if you take these 4 decades, that's 86% of U.S. coal-fired generation. 86% across the United States in those 4 decades. And in West Virginia, it's 93%. Now, why is that important? Coal-fired power plants will last about 60 to 65 years. This group here, this 4 decades, are now about 40 years old, 45 years old. So they're going to last maybe another 20 years, 15 to 20 years. Some of them are on accelerated retirements, and we all know about that. But this equipment is going to run out. It's going to get old. When we turn 65, it's going to start retiring, right? It's the same with equipment. We haven't built anything since really the 1980s, anything with substance. So we're going to take all of this infrastructure and we're going to lay it to waste. That's how I see it. We retire it, and it's not there for utilization anymore. But there's another path forward, and that path forward is 21st century coal. So, what can be the future of coal? Well, positioning the existing coal fleet for the future so that we preserve that existing infrastructure. Tax credit parity. Generation only qualifies if generator is dispatchable on demand, and generation only qualifies if there's a significant CO2 reduction. Right now, we've got production and investment tax credits for renewables. I'm going to talk about this in a little bit more detail, but they've been around for 30 years. And what we're suggesting is there are new imperatives. And that imperative is grid stability. We've seen what's happening in California. We've seen what's happening in Texas. You talk to PJM, you talk to MISO, their reserve margins are very thin. And so we need to think about grid stability. We need to think about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And how can we do that and preserve the existing infrastructure? And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. 45Q revisions. Congress did pass a law for 45Q, which is a tax credit for carbon capture and storage. It took the IRS 3 years to write the rules around this thing. I asked the Secretary of Energy to send letters over to Treasury. It took 2 letters from our 2 secretaries to get them to write the rules, but they finally did it. 3 years. What we need to do is now amend these things, and they haven't even been utilized yet, but we need to amend them. And then building a future for coal. We think a future for coal doesn't have to just be generation. It partly needs to be generation, but not just generation. It can also be coal products, and I know there's a lot of activity here in the state on coal products. It can also be coal to hydrogen. What I want to focus on is this net negative. So what are we talking about? If you burn coal and biomass, because biomass, when trees or agricultural products grow, they CO2. And if you harvest them and you burn them and then you capture the CO2 here, you end up with net negative emissions because that crop is absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere. You burn that crop, it emits CO2, but then you capture it and you store it underground. So the net of coal and biomass together, and we're talking about 20 to 30% biomass here, and the balance being coal. But the math works, and it's not mathematical sleight of hand, it works. It's being done in Europe right now. It's been done on a very limited basis here in the United States. What we're proposing is that we could keep all of that transmission infrastructure, coal handling infrastructure, and we either retrofit the existing boilers to burn biomass, or take that boiler out and build a 21st century coal plant that will burn biomass and can also burn municipal solid waste, it can burn natural gas, it can burn waste tires. We have the technology, we were developing it at DOE, they're continuing to develop it, just don't hear about it. We have the technology to build boilers, power plants that are much more efficient than what we have right now, that can burn multi-fuel and that can load fall. Because we're not getting rid of the renewables, right? They're going to stay with us. What we need to do is to be able to ramp up coal when the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining. And that has to happen very quickly. And some of this technology we're working on to do that. Okay, so what we're talking about here is getting funding for from the Department of, or for the Department of Energy to fund plants. And a qualifying project, and this is, I think, just common sense, is to be a qualifying project, it must have a positive economic impact on coal communities, because coal communities across the country, West Virginia, Utah, Wyoming, Kentucky, some in Ohio, they're suffering. And the coal plants, when they shut down, there's a huge tax base that's lost. So, you must have a positive economic impact on a coal community and must have net negative emissions using coal, biomass, and co-firing with CCUS. Congressman McKinley offered up a bill where we would get $300 million sent over, appropriated for the Department of Energy as grants, so that people, owners of power plants, can do a techno-economic study on their plant to determine if it's a viable candidate for a retrofit or repowering. Not every coal plant out there is a viable candidate. We need to do those studies, and I can guarantee you that the owners of those plants are not going to do the studies on their own. They're on a path to shut them down. But with federal funding, and by the way, when I first started thinking about how much was going to be needed, I thought $300 million was a lot of money. But it isn't anymore. We're talking trillions now. So this is small potatoes to keep coal-fired assets available for grid stability. We estimate that we need about $30 billion in cost share to demonstrate about 10 net negative plants. There's probably 4 or 5 different technologies out there for net negative that we could put 1 or 2 on various coal-fired power plants and demonstrate the viability of these various technologies. And then the power plant owners would competitively apply for grants and cost share on final investment decision project development, and a package of incentives to attract commercial investment and limit ratepayer impacts, and that's, of course, very important. We need to keep the cost of energy down. So, one of the questions we get asked a lot, is there enough biomass? And so we have some data here I want to share with you. Right here, this is 344 million dry tons per year in 2017. Now this is available for new uses. So we have about 344 million so almost doubling the amount of available biomass for new uses. So we got 212 gigawatts of generation right now in the United States operating. Some of that's going to be shut down, but just keep that number in mind, 212 gigawatts. We have 470-year supply of coal at 2020 consumption rates. So when we look at the biomass, if we assume 20% co-firing on that 212 gigawatts, we estimate it would be 125 million tons per year of biomass. Keep in mind, in 2017, we have 344 available. So the bottom line here is there's plenty of biomass out there from the timbering industry or agriculture to do this. Again, not every power plant is going to be able to convert, but some of them can. Okay, tax credit parity. About 30 years ago, Congress, in its infinite wisdom, decided that we needed to give tax credits to renewable power to reduce the cost. Our view is that 30 years of tax credit, we've accomplished the mission. And there's a lot of data on this chart. This is from the Energy Information Administration. They're part of DOE, and they're pretty much apolitical. So this is good data. A lot of it on, but what it's showing you here is various technologies, ultra-supercritical coal, combined cycle, that's natural gas, advanced nuclear, geothermal, biomass, wind, solar, and so on. And then this is the levelized cost of electricity for these various electricity sources. I want to bring your attention to onshore wind, solar, standalone, and solar hybrid. Now take a look at those numbers. They're $36 a megawatt hour to 40 or to 52. Compare that to coal, combined cycle, advanced nuclear. Mission accomplished, ladies and gentlemen. We used taxpayer dollars, we got the cost down, and there we are. But no, we want to continue funding this using taxpayer dollars to subsidize wind and solar. And I think that's the wrong strategy, because take a look at battery storage. It's $128 a megawatt hour. And the problems that we have seen, primarily in California, but also in Texas in the winter, when the wind wasn't blowing and the sun wasn't shining, they didn't have enough battery capacity to offset that renewable. So if we're going to continue doing investment tax credits and production tax credits, it needs to be focused on getting this cost down. But now we have other imperatives. And let's talk about those new imperatives. What are they? Well, I've alluded to some of them already. We need to maintain the U.S. electricity grid stability and reliability. And that's a dual challenge, because we have intermittent renewables presenting grid stability and reliability challenges. That should be exacerbated, not exasperated, but maybe exasperated is the right word. It is exacerbated by the need for electrification in the industrial sector and in the transportation sector. If we're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we have to do it across all sectors: power generation, industry, and transportation. We have more electric vehicles coming online. Industry is now starting to look at electrifying some of their processes. So electricity generation in this country is going to grow. Meanwhile, so it's growing, but our grids are becoming less and less stable. So we also have these aggressive administration CO2 targets, and we have a need for affordable electricity. And in order to keep it affordable, we have to maximize the existing infrastructure. I do not believe we can afford trillions of dollars to get us through this energy transition Because what will happen is industry has a choice. If they don't leave, they'll go to another country. We've always seen that, right? We need to keep our electricity affordable. So, that's the new imperative. So, this is what our proposal is, and we're working on some legislative language right now. Investment in production tax credits, also known as ITCs and PTCs, should be set up to incentivize low carbon, reliable power. So in order to do that, you have to have a minimum dispatchability requirement, and that would mean that nuclear, renewable, carbon capture enabled fossil fuel, and net negative fossil fuel plants can meet this dispatchability requirement either standalone or with battery capacity. So let me explain this in easier words. If a wind farm or a solar farm has battery capacity, backup capacity, they can apply for a production or investment tax credit because we want to get the cost of battery storage down. If they don't, they can't apply. If a nuclear unit, a new nuclear unit, and we're talking about small modular reactors these days, like in West Virginia has been working towards that, a small modular reactor could apply for a production investment tax credit because A, it's dispatchable, and B, it's zero carbon. Also, coal and natural gas could apply for those ITCs and PTCs if they have carbon capture, because they're dispatchable and they have low carbon. So we open the aperture on the ITCs and the PTCs to meet the new imperatives, which is making sure we have a reliable grid and an affordable electricity, and we reduce our greenhouse gas footprint. We no longer need to keep 30-year-old tax credits available for wind and solar. It's welfare, ladies and gentlemen, in my view. Okay, so zero carbon emitting plants would be eligible for the base PTC. Carbon capture enabled fossil plants, that's again both coal and natural gas, with 100% capture, less than 100% capture, would be eligible for reduced PTC. Conversely, if it's a net negative plant, you can get greater than 100%. So if you're zero emission, that's the baseline of 100% of the tax credit. If you're 90% capture, you'd get less of the tax credit. But if you're net negative, if you're coal and biomass and CCUS, you get greater than 100%. Let's balance it. And then 45Q carbon capture and storage tax credits. Our issue here is, you're familiar with direct air capture. They vacuum cleaner that sucks ambient air and takes the CO2 out of it. There's a lot of support on Capitol Hill to create a higher level of tax credit for direct air capture. Our view is that it should get the same tax credit as coal or natural gas in CCUS. So, what all this means is that, there's one other point I want to make to you. It's not on this slide, but we need to have the ability to stack these tax credits. In the renewables, we're talking now, or Congress is talking about a hydrogen production tax credit. That would be beneficial to West Virginia. But what they're talking about is stacking renewable production tax credits with the hydrogen tax credit, but not stacking 45Q, for example, with a hydrogen production tax credit. And we think that's wrong. If you're going to stack tax credits for renewables, you stack tax credits for fossil fuels. Okay. So, what are the required actions? What do we need to do? What are we here asking for? Well, we're asking for support, number one, on Congressman McKinley's bill. It's H.R. 4891. And under that bill, it establishes a net negative baseload power program at the Department of Energy, authorizes $300 million in immediately available grant funding for engineering and economic studies. Again, the techno-economic studies that would be done at these various coal-fired power plants around the country to determine if they're suitable candidates for coal, biomass, and CCUS. And it also provides DOE with new management tools and directs the acceleration of projects towards this goal. So appropriating the $300 million in grant funding is very important. And then next step in this would be providing $30 billion in funding for DOE to cost share the demonstration of these net negative projects. So that's the ask. We also want tax credit parity. It's time after 30 years and 45Q revisions. And ladies and gentlemen, that's what I came here to tell you today. Happy to answer any questions if there are.
Thank you, Steve. Other questions from the panel?
Yes, sir.
Thank you for the presentation. Quick question on biomass. In regards to West Virginia, do you see a certain type of biomass being productive used more in West Virginia, whether it's for agricultural, biodiesel, et cetera? Is it just looking at how that breaks down on those types?
Yeah, that's a great question. I probably forest products. You have a pretty robust forest industry, and there's a lot of, practically speaking, there's the forest industry doesn't, or the timber industry doesn't use the limbs and the twigs and the leaves and all that. So that's an area where West Virginia could obtain biomass. Now, maybe what you're also alluding to is would you pelletize it or not? And probably you would. Just from a technical perspective, burning biomass, it would burn better with coal if it was pelletized. Doesn't necessarily need to be, but the $300 million that we're talking about would do the techno-economic analysis on that particular coal plant to determine what the best mix of biomass and coal would be, and whether it should be pelletized or whether it could be just blown in. You would chop it up, hog it, and then just blow it into the boiler. So it really depends on the furnace size and the configuration. But it could also be corn stover, corn stalks. It can be switchgrass. As you move west of here, it's probably, out in Illinois or Indiana, it's probably not going to be forest products, but it could be prairie grass. There are opportunities to grow prairie grass on reclaimed mine lands, so that could be a possibility for West Virginia. And it's a perennial, so you harvest it. One key piece of this, you must replace the biomass. Otherwise, you're not net negative, because if you're going to harvest a tree, you have to replace it with another tree so that it can continue to absorb the CO2. And that is absolutely critical. We were talking about that earlier. Otherwise, it's not net negative. And I can tell you what's happening over in the UK. There's a company called Drax who had coal-fired power plants, and they converted them, initially co-fired them, so we know the technology works. They went to 100% biomass. They didn't install carbon capture, but they're under a lot of criticism now because it's questionable whether they are replanting the biomass that they're buying. Actually, they're buying it from the U.S. So the question is that biomass being replanted? I think it is, because they're probably buying from the companies that supply the paper industry, and those companies manage their forests very well. But that's a criticism that we have to overcome. A long-winded answer to your short question, sorry. Yes, sir.
Steve, thanks so much for your presentation. You've been for a long time. You've always done a great job. On more than one occasion, you alluded to the fact that success of this will be related to carbon capture. Given the state of our carbon capture, and infrastructure that's going to be developed in the pipeline,
the dynamic there that we have to maintain from a cost perspective over time? Getting pipes, getting things in there.
That's a great question. We need to build out that infrastructure. There's no question about it. Pipeline infrastructure. West Virginia has reasonable geology for sequestering CO2, but it's not as good as what you see west of here in Illinois and Indiana. There's a formation called Mount Simon. It's just very prolific for CO2 capture. Also, you probably are aware that ExxonMobil has a $100 billion proposed project to sequester CO2 down in the Gulf of Mexico offshore. So that's also a prolific field, but we need to build pipelines down there. Battelle, they're headquartered out of Columbus. They run 8 national labs, and they do the Midwest Regional Carbon Sequestration Partnership, which West Virginia is part of. The geology on the Atlantic coast is actually really good. So you could have offshore wind and use those platforms for wells. So you pipe the CO2 out to those wind platforms and then inject it subsurface in the Atlantic Ocean, below the water, so it would be down into the geology below the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. But it's a pretty prolific field. So my point is, across the 48 states, and even 49, including Alaska, we've characterized the geology. We know where there's good geology for CO2 sequestration. What we haven't done is we haven't built out the infrastructure. And then on the carbon capture, there's still more work to be done on reducing the cost. We were on, when I got to DOE, the cost of carbon capture was about $70 a ton. We got it down to about $45 a ton in the 3 years because we had a very aggressive program. We could take it to $30 a ton. And at $30 a ton and a production tax credit and a 45Q, the economics work. People can make a return on investment if you can get it down to $30 a ton. And there is a technological roadmap that will allow us to do that. And I'll be fair, this administration is moving forward with that. But when they think about carbon capture, they think about it in terms of the industrial sector and natural gas, combined cycle plants, not coal. And we can't get rid of the coal. More important, we have the capability to develop this technology and export it to other countries that have stated that they're going to continue burning coal. And that's China and India and other countries in Asia. We gave up ownership of coal-fired technology in the late 70s, early 80s. And I can tell you what happened. When we stopped building those coal-fired boilers, the company I worked for, Foster Wheeler, we went to China. And we worked over there for 5 years. And after about 5 years, they had our technology. They didn't need us anymore. And now China is selling our 1970s technology all around the world. And we're out of the business. We can get back into business if we put a small amount of money and ingenuity towards 21st century coal. We can get the price down on carbon capture. I think we can get it down to probably $20. Not in the next 5-10 years, but further out, we could. And then coal can stay in the mix, as can natural gas. I can't take a question.
I didn't ask a question. Steve, the ESG is a huge issue, and ESG, if you look at the literature, is a CO2 issue, although it we have much more than that. But as a offensive play on ESG, advancing, what is the value of advancing this technology to satisfy the investment community that we are on path to 21st century?
Another great question. I think, unfortunately, I think a number in the investment community have written off coal. Finished, done. But I think what's also going to happen is, I mean, we're already seeing this in Europe, right? The price of natural gas and a lot more coal being exported. So people are going to start to see that we can't give up this high energy fuel. And so to satisfy the ESG concerns, we need technology to demonstrate that it can be burned clean. Are we going to satisfy all of the NGOs out there? No. There are some that think we can do all of this with wind and solar and batteries. And we can electrify the entire U.S. automobile fleet. And industry goes all electric. When you think about that, there's going to be 3 times as much electricity as we have right now to do that. And that's all going to come from wind and solar and batteries. Don't worry. It makes no sense. So I think the ESG issues are there. They're not going to go away, but we need to keep people thinking about an all-the-above strategy. And the only way to do that is through technology advancements. One other point on this, Charlie, sort of both your question. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, came out with their 6th assessment report a couple of weeks ago. I'm sure you've all read the 3,600 pages of the report. I keep one on my bedside table. I read a chapter to my wife every night's working. Anyway, quit laughing, it's true. So,
I wondered what the bumps on your head were now.
So anyway, they did 7 different scenarios on how you get to a 1.5 degree. The modeling they do in climate change, they were looking at 2-degree increase in temperature, and now they've gone to 1.5. And so what do you need to do to make sure that the globe has no more than a 1.5 degree increase in temperature by, I think it's 2100. And what do you need to do by 2050 to make sure that happens? So that's sort of the platform that they operate on. They came up with 7 scenarios. One of those scenarios did not use CCUS at all. And an interesting part of that scenario is that without CCUS, we have, as a globe, we have to reduce energy consumption by 50% in the next 30 years. Now think about that. We got almost 1 billion people that have no electricity. We got another 1.5 billion that live in energy poverty. And we're going to go to 10 billion people here in that period of time. Another 3 billion people, just under 3 billion people. And while we're having this population growth in undeveloped countries, we're going to reduce energy consumption by 50%. Not going to happen. We all know that. IPCC knows that. But they bookended it. They said, if you don't do CCUS, then you have to reduce energy consumption. What that's really saying is, we've got to do CCUS if we want to meet any of the goals, any of the countries in the world we're talking about. We got to get it commercialized. And we're not doing it. We've commercialized renewables. Let's get on and commercialize the rest of this technology.
Just one more comment, maybe I think what's maybe frustrating for folks in this room is we seem to be the only country in the world that's attempting to achieve these type of goals, while others seem to be economic. In fact, if I can say China out loud, say even though they're running on power plants in a few weeks, I bet that doesn't come with any type of sequestration to reduce globally.
Yeah. And I think reality is starting to emerge. And this tragic situation we have in Ukraine is waking up Europe. Russia cut off to Germany, who is sort of the shining star on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, gets 30% of their electricity from coal. And they're starting up coal-fired power plants that they shut down, as are others in Europe. The UK is considering unconventional oil and gas, fracking. Whether they do it or not, I don't know. Whether they get past all the public opposition, I'm a little bit skeptical they can. But the point is, they banned it, and now they're thinking about it again and talking about it in sessions like this. Because reality is starting to take root, I think. I hope reality is taking root. We'll see. But it takes root if people like you can help push this. Yes, sir.
Steve, very informative presentation, great job. A question regarding Drax that was sold in the UK. I was under the understanding that there were still 2 units at Drax that were on coal. They had converted them all to wood or biomass. I was curious because I have a friend at Uniper, which is one of the largest producers in Europe. And he was telling me that I'd heard or read somewhere that Drax was looking to convert a unit back to coal to address this deficit coming from the Russian gas situation. And he informed me that there were 2 units still, operating on coal at Drax. So, I don't know. I was curious to see if you knew anything about that.
I'm sorry, I do not. I can find out and get back and let you know.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. I was not, I had heard that they were, there was some discussion about going back to coal on some of these, some of them are not capable of going back to coal. But I heard that, or read that. I had not heard that there were still 2 plants in the UK that were on coal. I thought
Two
they,
units at Drax.
Right.
So they had the 2 units
okay.
were burning coal, my understanding from talking with them. But I've read the same thing, I guess you'd read, that they were looking to convert back instead of doing just a blend of coal as you're proposing, which is very reasonable.
I don't know, we'll look into that.
Be interesting to see, but I think a blend of coal and biomass is certainly an achievable objective.
I mean, it might also be that people in Europe, countries are turning over every rock to find ways to overcome this problem that they've got. Natural gas, $14, $15, $16. And that starts to really
Make you work hard.
Yeah, yeah. But I'll look at that. That's a good question.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Steve.
Okay, thanks.
Appreciate you doing this. Okay, well, you've heard our very informative first presentation, and you heard the word batteries mentioned numerous times in that presentation and in some of the questions. And now we have an expert in that field, I believe, who's going to talk to us. And Mr. Presbali is going to introduce her.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Unlike Mr. Winberg, our next guest has not been to West Virginia the first time. In fact, this is her first time to West Virginia. She's come down from New York City to discuss with us battery technology. Isabel Bronco Lowe is with Fluence Energy, a Siemens and AES venture. I believe that's correct. And she's going to discuss with us, give us an overview of battery technology and potential opportunities in West Virginia. So with that, Isabel, turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here. Took a beautiful walk down the river yesterday in Charleston. Incredible. Just a nice, quiet reprieve from New York City.
We
So-
find you a nice little place here.
I'm sure on the mountains, it's really gorgeous. So thank you for the invite. This was a great trip for me, and I hope to be back. So I work for Fluence Energy, which is the leading battery energy storage technology provider in the globe. And I work on the growth team, so typically I'm working on market research and the competitive landscape for energy storage. But there are other people on my team working specifically on policy and regulatory affairs, so I hope that this presentation sort of reflects my entire team's work. Just to give you an agenda, an idea of where we're going, I'll start with a Fluence introduction, so you can get an idea of the company's history, where we've been, move on to energy storage applications and use cases, dive into the technology and the product, and then lastly, some opportunities for West Virginia, and a little policy recommendation at the very end. Feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions as we go. This is a pretty intimate group, but I'll also leave time at the end for questions. So before I get into the first section, I just wanted to show this graphic. This is a load profile of a day in New York City in 1893 and the energy demand. And you can see Thomas Edison's scrawl there, and the shaded parts are how battery storage along the system, we're going to sort of smooth those peaks and valleys. So this technology has been around some odd 130 years, and it was actually deployed on that very rudimentary grid a long time ago. Fast forward to today, and we're looking at a tremendous outlook in the energy storage market globally. This is largely buoyed by billions of dollars in investment, steep technology price decline, and also some favorable policies that are helping it along. But you can see the bottom dark blue, there's consistent growth in the Americas region. And we really take pride in the interest that the US has in energy storage right now. So moving into Fluence and how we fit into the market. Fluence, which was AES and then became Fluence with a joint venture in Siemens, was here from the beginning. Not 1893 beginning, but 2009 beginning. This is the first lithium-ion battery energy storage system commercially deployed. And this is in the middle of the Atacama Desert in Chile. And I specify that it's the lithium-ion battery technology because Fluence focuses on that technology, and so does 90% of the market. And there's two reasons why that technology is, the focus. The first is because the way our supply chain works, we can get lithium at scale and the other components of the technology. And then second, it's a mature, proven, and bankable technology. So whenever you hear battery-based storage, unless it's otherwise specified, you can probably safely assume it's lithium-ion. So this was the first lithium-ion battery energy storage system deployed, Fluence system. It's 12 megawatts and a 30-minute duration. So usually we rate battery storage with a power rating and then a duration. So it can supply 12 megawatts of power for 30 minutes before it has to charge again. And you can have longer durations. You can have 4 hours of duration. It really depends on the application. Now, since then, we've deployed many, many, many more systems, and we've been guided by this mission to transform the way we power our world. And you can take this mission statement in a number of ways, but what it means to me is to ensure reliable power, efficient power, and when we think about heading into the modern era, making sure the power system has a level of digitization component to it, which I'll get into in a bit. So the Fluence product has been deployed across the globe, almost on every continent, at big scale. Our product, which is the actual hardware, we have 4+ gigawatts installed. Our Fluence services, which is either Fluence serving and operating and maintaining all of these hardware systems. We have about 2.9 gigawatts under management. And then our digital platform, which is overlaid onto our hardware, makes sure that that energy can be optimally dispatched in the wholesale markets and create revenue streams for our customers. And that's overlaid on about 5 gigawatts of storage assets. And you might wonder, wait, how is 5 gigawatts of software, but you only have 4.2 gigawatts of hardware? Our software actually works on non-Fluence assets as well. So if you're interested in optimizing the dispatch of your assets in the wholesale market, you can use Fluence IQ and buy that in a separate package. Now, zooming in and understanding Fluence's impact at home, we have many, many, many more projects than just these three, but I wanted to stop and show the variation in geography here. We have projects in Indiana, Arizona, California. They're varying sizes. They were deployed at different times, 2017, 2018, 2021. They actually use slightly different technology as the company has matured, and they're for different applications. So the first one is co-located with a natural gas plant. The second one is a storage transmission asset, and the third is for peaker use. And I'll get into those applications more specifically, but just so you can get a broad idea of the variation in our products and focused on the United States. And of course, we do have a project in West Virginia. The Laurel Mountain energy storage system is co-located with wind. So when the wind isn't blowing, the battery system can dispatch any of that stored energy to make sure that the plant is running smoothly, and it provides grid balancing services to PJM. And if you notice, this was delivered in 2011, so really only 2 years after that Atacama first commercially deployed project. So we've been here for quite a while, and we hope to continue doing business here. Now, I brushed over some of those applications when we were showing those United States projects, and I'll get into a bit more detail. So really what the value of energy storage, where the value lies, is in value stacking. So it can deliver many services at once. Of course, storage can be charged and discharged, which allows it to perform a lot of these services, can provide real and reactive power to the grid, and it delivers value not only for the owners of the assets, but for the operators of the grid. So this chart is a very famous chart. I encourage you to check it out. It's a Rocky Mountain Institute paper on the economics of battery storage. And I won't go through each individual service, but it shows 13 services that battery energy storage is capable of delivering. And it addresses needs from the customer, so maybe a commercial or industrial facility who owns a battery, or a retail customer, the utility and the independent service provider, as well as the ISO and operators. So it's really sort of like the Swiss Army knife of technologies. It can really provide a lot of services, and some of them at the same time. Now, here's the Fluence version. It's a little bit more legible, so you can follow along. And the way that we separate them is into 3 buckets. So we can transform our network. So when the network is experiencing great peaks of demand, we can relieve some of that peak, kind of like the Edison drawing that you saw the little shades on, so that we can discharge our energy, our battery energy storage at that time. When there's transmission congestion, you can switch on that battery energy storage to relieve some of that congestion. Usually transmission lines are redundant, and instead of investing a lot of energy, a lot of money and capital into creating redundant systems, we can throw in a battery storage system for that redundancy to provide backup power, and it can provide reliability to the distribution grid as well. When we think about transforming our generation, we can provide grid services such as frequency regulation, again, peaking capacity to smooth some of those valleys and peaks. Wholesale energy trading, like I said, our IQ software allows the system to be optimized in the wholesale markets, and it can be co-located with renewables. We saw that in Laurel Mountain, helping produce power even when the wind isn't blowing. Lastly, when you think of the customer, your energy use, if there's a blackout, you can have backup power so that your facility isn't interrupted. Energy cost control, which I'll get into a little bit, but when there's a crazy spike in energy prices, you might want to switch on your battery so that you don't have to pay those insane prices. Or if you want to be able to completely disconnect from the grid, an energy storage system can be part of a microgrid, so you can be self-sufficient. Now, not all of these applications are created equal. You can see this curve is a steep decline since 2010 in the price of battery cells, and this is projected to continue. But back in 2010, frequency regulation was really the only economical application for energy storage. And since then, we've unlocked generation enhancement, capacity peak power, energy cost control, microgrids, co-location with renewables, and right now we're in the state of proving the business case for transmission and distribution enhancement, and critical power. So just so you see a roadmap of how things have become economical and the applications that have been unlocked over time. Now, I just want to focus on two that I think are particularly relevant to this audience. So when we talk about peaking power, not only can battery storage provide peaking power, we throw flexible in front of peaking power because it has a little bit of an extra edge over traditional peaking power assets. When instead of just being used for those few hours during the year when it's a hot summer afternoon, all the air conditioners are running, obviously energy storage can be deployed then, but in the rest of the year, it can also provide ancillary services. So that's that sort of value stacking I was addressing before. It can also ramp up and ramp down quicker than a traditional unit. And there is a use case for having sort of modular application. So you might deploy these assets closer to the load, which could have locational benefits as well. So that's why we kind of tack on flexible in front of peaking power. And one example is this AES Alamitos project that Fluence has deployed in California. Energy cost control is another one I want to focus on, and I spoke a little bit about it, but you could be a mining facility, a manufacturing facility, and energy costs all of a sudden are spiking. Instead of drawing power from the grid, turn on your battery storage and cut your costs. Let's say you can't get power from the grid for whatever reason, or not enough. Instead of interrupting your facility and capabilities, which can be costly, you can throw on your battery storage and sort of prevent those interruptions. Now, diving into the actual product so you can kind of understand the components that go into a system. This is a Fluence system, and our sort of hallmark design is that we have cubes. And these are about 8 foot by 8 foot, and each cube holds 2 racks of 8 batteries. And when I first got into energy storage, I kind of thought it was just boxes of batteries, that was it. But there's also a controller in these cubes, a battery management system, a chiller to make sure that things don't overheat. There are safety components in there to make sure that if something happens, an incident, a fire is started, that can be disconnected quickly and dealt with. And then, of course, connections between the cubes and within the batteries. To your left, you'll also see the PCS, which is the power conversion system, and that changes the electricity from DC to AC so it connects to the grid and vice versa when it's charging and discharging. And then, of course, we have our communications cabinet, which holds more controls, the aux load, and again, some safety measures as well. So when you think of a system, it really is a lot of components put together. It's not just the batteries. Yes?
The cube, how many, what's the size of that, kilowatts or megawatts? 745 per cube. It's about 372 per rack. Kilowatt hour. How sorry, those numbers again?
745 kilowatt hour per cube, and then per rack is about 372. And there are 2 racks in a cube. Now, we haven't always had a cube. When you saw that Atacama Desert project, it was more like a giant building or container. There are a lot of reasons why we've switched to the cube design, one of them being flexibility. If we want a variable duration, or it's for a specific application, you might want to mix and match the way the size of the project is. Also for safety, if there is a fire incident or something happens and the whole building or the whole container lights on fire, then your project is not doing too hot. If you have cubes, that can be isolated and disconnected from the system. And you can see Fluence has continuously improved its design, and you'll see that other energy storage systems, some of them are copying this cube design, some are going a different way. But there are trade-offs to both, and we find that the cube technology is definitely the prevailing one. I won't go into too much detail, but cubes connected together behind a DC bus we refer to as a node. A collection of nodes behind one transformer is a core, and then a collection of cores makes up the entire system. And now, different systems serving different applications, we call them different products. So our standalone utility scale product is our grid stack. Our DC coupled solar plus storage product is our sun stack. And then when we go to commercial and industrial uses, more on the edge of the grid, we call that edge stack. And again, hardware is not the only part of this system. We also have our Fluence OS, which is our name for our control system that allows for visibility into what's happening and how to charge, discharge optimally, make sure everything is working properly. And then we have our Fluence IQ, which I alluded to earlier, which is a way to optimally dispatch this energy into the wholesale market. So ideally, right, you want to buy energy or charge your system when prices are low, and you want to discharge when prices are high. So our customers are finding those additional revenue streams are incredibly important in justifying the upfront cost of a system like this. And I want to specifically call out our safety features. The battery management system, which is part of the controls infrastructure, is sort of our first line of defense. So if something fishy is going on, ideally an alert will be sent to the control, and whoever's operating the asset will get an alert and see something's not working correctly. There's a fast stop button in case there's a technician and sees something that needs to be disconnected. There's gas detection, fire suppression system, deflagration panels. In case for some reason a fire does break out, we can remotely monitor the system and make sure that the fire is put out. And then lastly, some mechanical safety features. We don't need to go into any of it, but these are 8 foot by 8 foot, very, very, very heavy containers. We want to make sure the doors aren't slamming on anybody, and that things feel safe for the technicians, for the people installing these systems, and for the people who live around these systems as well. Now, opportunities for storage in West Virginia. So zooming out a bit from West Virginia, if we look at PJM, PJM was an early mover for energy storage systems way back in 2015. And the first market that's usually addressed when you're new to energy storage is the ancillary services market. And when you saw that steep decline of battery prices, right, frequency regulation was one of the first to be unlocked. So that totally makes sense for the business case. Since then, the ancillary services market has been a bit saturated, right? These are shallow markets. So we encourage PJM and participants to move away from ancillary services and go to other applications such as energy arbitrage, which we see CAISO and ERCOT moving into. So that's definitely a transition that still needs to happen in PJM, but we are excited and confident that this will happen based on some of our interconnection request data here. So back in 2015, you can't even see it on here, but I zoomed in on my computer on my phone as well, and you can see a tiny orange sliver, and that's energy storage in 2015. That's probably that some odd 100 megawatts that was being used for ancillary services. And when you fast forward to 2021, there were 13.8 gigawatts of energy storage in the queue. And of course, a majority of this is not going to be put online, but it's definitely a directional indicator that PJM is interested in moving on from ancillary services and heading into those other markets. So this is definitely a train that's moving and moving quickly. And we can actually see something similar in West Virginia. In 2020, you can see a tiny blue energy storage, 46.2 megawatts, has jumped to 894. That's about 19 times. This 2022 year-to-date is relatively small, both because of COVID impacts catching up. It takes about a year and a half for the storage supply chain to get impacted, and it's only been the first quarter. So we'll see how this grows over time, but there is promise here in West Virginia and in PJM. So you might be wondering, what are some of the key policy points that PJM is paying attention to, and constituents like Fluence? So in the capacity market, there used to be a rule in PJM that valued systems of longer duration, 10 hours or more than assets that were only providing 2 hours of duration. Now again, duration is how long it can provide that maximum power for. And lithium ion technology, typically, it's like 4 to 8 hours. So that really was not valuing our systems properly. You might think longer duration means more value, but for ancillary services, you don't need 10 hours of duration. So that rule has since been knocked down, which is great for energy storage, but we're also targeting the effective load carrying capacity structure, which is another sort of piece that values assets at different durations, and we hope that we can get simple durations to be valued appropriately. So that's definitely like an ongoing push for Fluence and other energy storage participants. Storage is transmission. Again, that declining graph that I showed you that unlocked different applications, storage as transmission was one of the last ones. It's 2020, 2021. Now we're in 2022. It's happening. There's a demand for it. And there's current initiatives to help develop rules for storage as transmission in PJM so that they can be valued appropriately. Lastly, Order 2222 is sort of a landmark order for distributed energy resources. So this isn't just for storage. This could be for rooftop solar panels, for diesel generators, whatever it is. But the idea is that the combination of 10 megawatt systems or 100 1 megawatt systems combined together should compete exactly the same way as one 100 megawatt system. So it's aggregating all these distributed resources and competing in the wholesale market just like one large system would compete. So this order was passed a few years ago. Compliance filing was in February, and we're looking forward to that coming underway. Now, setting an energy storage deployment goal has traditionally been the first step in a state welcoming energy storage. So you typically establish a goal and set a clear indication for the value of energy storage. And what that does is allows you to learn by doing. You don't have to have anything figured out before setting this goal, but utilities, regulators, and agencies will figure it out as time goes. It also sends demand signals to developers and investors that a place like West Virginia is open for business, which is very exciting. Michigan, New Jersey, Virginia have all set these kinds of goals, targets, mandates, whatever you want to call them. And typically this is the first policy step that a state in West Virginia's journey would take. So with that, that concludes the presentation. I hope you learned a little bit about energy storage. I did not bring my card because I haven't spoken in person in a long, long time. So please take a picture if you have any questions, and I'm happy to answer questions now live as well.
Question?
Yes, sir. Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you for coming down.
Yeah?
Great presentation. This may seem like an odd question, but is there any reason that the battery storage couldn't be used by baseload plants?
No.
And what I mean by that is like a coal-fired plant has a big battery so that it can act as baseload and a peaker plant?
Yeah.
Has that been used anywhere? Is that technology out there? How large do you think something like that would have to be?
That's a good question. I know co-location with baseload thermal generation is possible. With coal, I don't have one off the top of my head. But let me get back to the team and I'll see if we have any case studies offhand. Definitely with natural gas plants.
Technically, there's no reason you could, and in fact, if you've got a coal plant that's operating at base load on a pounds per kilowatt hour basis, it's going to have its lowest emissions within base load. So if there was co-located storage capacity, battery or pumped hydro or whatever it might be,
don't know exactly how it's been measured, but one thing Michigan has been doing, obviously, the sort of home base for auto manufacturing in the past many years, to buoy the interest in energy storage, they've also developed battery manufacturing facilities, not only for stationary energy storage, but for EVs. So a lot of these future technologies can work nicely with energy storage as well. So that's sort of one adjacent industry that has flooded to places that are showing interest in uses for batteries. Why don't we make them ourselves?
This, I always kind of go basic because that's how I understand things better. How do you determine rate structure? I think during your presentation, Melanie, you said, if I heard correctly,
one of the advantages is being able to discharge from kinds of high prices to offset and moderate them. How do you establish rates if you charge a facility, you're discharging, and now you have to come back and recharge at maybe a rate as high as someone who's already purchased something and needed it for the reason of reducing the rate.
So you're saying once it's clipped, that peak, it still needs to recharge eventually?
which was my second question, what's the recharging time and what's it take you to get from when you discharge to be able to recharge and go again? But I'm just trying to figure out from a rate structure, when you're determining how you base what you're going to charge for the service. You have a charge facility at X, you discharge at X, and then you have to recharge at maybe something higher than the original charge.
I see. So it's like, how do you have foresight into what the best way to charge and discharge?
How do you keep your customer from these type of potential swings in price?
So I guess the way the technology works is that you don't have to charge and discharge all at once. So let's say the peak only lasts for 30 minutes, but you have a 4-hour system. You might discharge for 30 minutes, and then you still have 3 hours and 30 minutes to either not, depending on what the price is, it'll give that signal to whether to charge or discharge. So I'd say that typically the application for energy markets isn't the full duration of the system, if that makes sense. So it's kind of like charging your laptop. You don't always let it go dead. Sometimes you plug it in when it's 50%. The second part of your question was, how do we optimize and provide foresight into when things are going to peak and dip? So that's that Fluence IQ software that we have. So it's AI-based, it's machine learning based. It connects to your system and sort of learns the ebbs and flows, and some of that is not predictable, but I think our foresight is above 95% based on backward-looking metrics. So it's nearly perfect in predicting when things are going to peak and when things are going to dip. So that digital component is kind of key. It's more sophisticated than traders using an Excel sheet. It's really its own software platform backed by machine learning.
I like the smart code concept. It learns itself what your load profile may be and when energy is needed and not needed and whatever.
Exactly.
Nice
Exactly.
presentation, by the way.
Thank you so much. Yes.
Great presentation, by the way, very informative. With regard to the lithium, how has the increased cost of, securing lithium supplies affected the cost of the unit? Is it a significant component of the pricing, or, I guess the components altogether? Is the lithium that is used in the manufacture, is it one of the highest costs, or are the other components as equal as cost?
I'm trying to recall, I just looked at a graphic. I think it's something like 40% of the cost of the battery cell is lithium. But that's only the battery cell, right? It's not the balance of plant, it's not the enclosure, it's not all the part of the system.
Right.
So something from, let's just say 40%. I want to correct myself. But securing lithium abundance is not the problem, right? there's a big push right now to ramp up lithium mining activity, because it will take about 5 to 10 years for us to meet that supply. And that's not only demand from stationary energy storage, it's from electric vehicles is most of that demand. So we're kind of riding the wave of this push to increase lithium resources, and it's kind of uncertain where it's going to go. If we get a lot of investment going now to secure those resources, we may be okay. If we lag behind and wait any longer, it might be difficult. Fluence isn't in the raw materials lithium business, so we rely on our suppliers for that, but it's definitely something we're pushing for. But you could see that steep decline of battery cell prices. A lot of that was the lithium and the technology metal components surrounding that, and we forecast that that's going to continue to go down.
Thank you. Sure. One more question.
Yeah.
What is the end of life strategy on these disposal and landfill, and how are the costs to end of life?
Yeah, so what's really cool about battery technology, again, I said, like, it's not only stationary energy storage, it's EVs. We have this big question of what's going to happen afterward. You can take the actual battery cells and mine them for their raw materials and reuse them. There's actually a small second life battery market that does occur. So it's kind of like, it's the same technology, extraction capabilities that if you recycle your laptop battery. It's actually the same plants. Northvolt, who's one of our partners going forward for our battery supply, is actually building a recycling facility right now. So it's kind of anticipating that crazy demand for battery recycling. There's also a number of other companies in the United States that are looking for that. But it's definitely something that won't be of significant scale for another 5 or 10 years once these 20-year systems, the cars, need to do something with those batteries. So it's something that's scaling up now in preparation.
Great presentation. Thank you so much. Where are most of these made that we've seen pictures of?
So it depends what part of the...
Where are your products made? Where are you manufacturing?
So the actual batteries are made in China, but we're looking to diversify that supply chain. Our partnership with Northvolt is in Europe. And there are battery manufacturers that we're talking to in the United States, but it's not at scale yet. The enclosure is actually made in Vietnam to get ahead of some of those potential tariffs. And I guess those are the main parts. Oh, and the PCS, that's usually from a supplier, which could be China, Europe, United States. That really differs.
So not a lot of it in the U.S. right now?
Not yet, but that's something that we're definitely thinking about and is on our roadmap as well.
We'd love to help you think through that. But let's talk about that for a moment, the lithium. What does the actual mining look like? Have you seen it?
I have not. I can definitely connect you to somebody.
I Googled it, just out of curiosity.
Yeah, and what'd you find?
What it made our mountaintop removal project look like cakewalk. It was intriguing. You know, one of the things I thought we were trying to fix was the environmental issues, and it looks to me like getting to lithium is a pretty difficult proposition and doesn't leave a landscape looking very attractive. Anyway, just a thought. So the raw materials are the lithium, the enclosure, and the enclosure is it steel or aluminum?
It's a good question. Not an enclosure engineer, so I don't know, but I can get back to you on that.
Just curious. And in terms of, I think you said something like the few hours a year that you need for peaking. We had a presentation last month from our Public Service Commission that seemed to leave me with the impression that base load was not achievable with battery power. How are they charged? What charges them after they discharge?
The grid. Or it could be the sun or the wind. You know, it depends if you have an off-grid system or an on-grid system. So it's connected to the grid, so when it's taking power from the grid when electricity prices are low or demand is low, and then sending it back to the grid. It's kind of just like a little holding waiting room, essentially, for those electrons.
And so the size of the installation depends on what the perceived need is going to be.
Right. And the duration also differs per application, but that's kind of getting into the technical details of it. But it's relatively flexible, which is a good thing. And if you are using it for one application and you have extra power left over, you might provide the grid with ancillary services, or you know, there's a ability to stack those applications. It really is custom to what the load center needs. So that's kind of like the fascinating part of this tool.
Other questions?
The recycling plant that you partnered with Northville, by the way, my son-in-law works at Northville.
Oh, no way, that's great. Very
He's
cool.
French, but I still love him. Anyway, where is that recycling plant being built? I know they're building in Poland, they're building in Sweden.
Sweden,
Is the recycling plant in Sweden?
I think.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what's the nature of the relationship between Northville Fluence?
I don't want to say it wrong, but you can look it up.
Okay.
It's the first thing that'll pop up on Google, Fluence Northville.
Okay, I'll do that, thank you.
Isabel, what a great pleasure to have you here. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I'd love to invite you back for a week as my guest and just kind of let you look West Virginia over, and maybe we could recruit you to come here and do some great things.
That
Maybe
sounds
build some
wonderful.
batteries.
Yeah, that would be great. It's beautiful here, so I'd love a week to stay in the mountains. Appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
A couple of announcements. We're building a website for this group. Our Commerce Communications team is doing that. You probably have seen them in the back today. They're going to be recording these sessions. They'll be available on our website once we get that done. We're working on programming or speakers for future meetings. Nick has been very helpful in helping me come up with ideas. I've approached Mr. Bird, representatives from the natural gas industry and pipeline folks to come and enlighten us some more, which is really kind of what we're all about right now. We're going to do the same, obviously, with the coal industry. Learn as much as we can, absorb as much as we can, help us to recommend policy and make decisions that will move West Virginia forward and prepare us for what's here and for what's coming. Any other remarks by members before we close? Mr. Bird,
No, sir. We've very appreciative of the speakers you've already pulled together. It's been very informative the last couple of months.
Nothing, Mr. Chairman, thank you.
okay. All right. Then hearing no further remarks, look to my left for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
You have a motion and a second? Second. You have a second? All in favor? Aye. We are adjourned. Thank you all. Good presentation. Yeah.